Hi, my name is Meg, and you are watching my YouTube show Meg Spiel. Earlier this spring, I was lucky enough to attend this year's International Board Game Researchers Conference in Chemnitz, Saxony, known as Karl-Marx-Stadt during Soviet times. Here's my report. The Board Game Studies Colloquium was held for the 27th time. The club's first meeting took place in 1995, and in 1997, the first issue of the Board Game Studies Journal was published, which is still going strong today. The journal's founder and editor is Alex de Vogt, a Dutch researcher, now a professor at Drew University in New Jersey, whose lecture I also attended in Berlin the day before the conference. I even got to chat with the founding father of board game studies during a coffee break. During our conversation, I mentioned a theory that proposed dividing all classic board games into four categories, reflecting the main aspects of human activity: warfare, chess, traveling, backgammon, territory control, Go, and agriculture, Mancala. I told Professor Vogt that while doing my research project in Bishkek, I was particularly interested in the local Mancala game called Tagus Kargol. So I asked him, if games based on Mancala mechanics are devoted to agriculture, could it be argued that among the once nomadic people of Central Asia, these games brought by Arabs from Africa became popular precisely during the transition to sedentary way of life? According to Herr Vogt, this theory is outdated. In classic games, the theme can be easily reinterpreted depending on the local context. For example, in nomadic cultures, instead of shared pool of seeds that players control by moving them around the holes, the theme could be easily transformed into sheep gazing. Among the speakers at the colloquium in Chemnitz, many were quite elderly. No wonder, after so many years of researching board games. Both the colloquium and the journal are mostly devoted to classic board games, chess, backgammon, and Mancala games. However, among the lecturers, there were also younger researchers whose interest often lies in more modern games. After studying the program, I chose one of the days to come to Chemnitz in person, while on the other days I selectively listened to a few talks via Zoom. Many of these talks were devoted to the musification of board games. For example, I learned that the only full-fledged board game museum is located here in Chemnitz, which holds the prestigious status of European Capital of Culture this year. One of the problems with musification of board games is that games should be played, not just looked at behind the glass in an exhibit. Another issue with the musification of modern board games is the widespread use of plastic components, which museum workers are reluctant to deal with. It's unknown how plastic will change its qualities over time and how to restore it if necessary. One of the reports was entirely devoted to the history of modern materials in games. Manufacturers of new types of rubbers, plastic, and other materials designated to replace, for example, ivory, very often advertise them through the creation of their chess and checkers sets. Examples from the USA and USSR were presented. The title of another report aroused my special interest, as it mentioned two of my main hobbies and research topics at once: board games and graffiti. But the lecturer from India was reporting not about modern games and youth subculture, but about ancient Indian games chiseled on the walls of ancient temples, which she and her colleagues researched in the jungles of Maharashtra state. However, my interest is still related to more modern phenomena. The blog I came to Chemnitz was devoted to board games in 20th century Germany. It was not only the possibility to listen to presentations in person and chat with the colleagues, but also to see a small board game museum that was organized at the colloquium site, where many fascinating old board games, including games made in the GDR, were on display. The first speaker in the blog was presenting how game design developed in the GDR. The main focus was on the game Train and its author, probably the only professional game designer in East Germany. In those years, publishers were willing to publish games, but were very limited in what they could produce. For example, one author was refused publication because the publisher was simply couldn't produce the game. But they had a lot of dominoes in stock, so they offered the author to invent a board game with dominoes instead. Analyzing the train game, a rare example of a rather complex strategic and economic game at that time, the lecturer noted its unusual aspects. For example, most of the resources and elements on the board belonged to all players, which probably reflected the idea of abandoning private property in socialist state. The next talk, which I found especially interesting, was devoted to the less official aspects of board game hobby in those years, DIY games. The lecturer and the co-author of a book about games in the GDR and representative of an organization dedicated to educational board games talked about how people created their own copies of games smuggled from the West. First and foremost, of course, Monopoly. Among the examples in the book and the keynote presentation are many quite creative interpretations of well-known games, in which not only the names, flavor text, and settings were changed, which is also super interesting, but also the game mechanics. For example, the famous Game of Life was reworked by one of enthusiasts so that events affected all players, not just one of them, quite possibly also reflecting the less individualistic nature of life under state socialism.
And so on. But in this game, it's the wheel of life. When you roll a certain number on the die, the whole wheel is spinning and everyone else gets to another position on the board. This is actually kind of a funny change of the rules he did here.
Some of these games were highly politicized, so there were also examples of such underground authors and their creations being investigated by the Stasi.
A year of planned fulfillment at the Zentrale. The Zentrale was the local cement plant where prisoners had to work. And he told me, kind of silent, and you have to imagine, we also had a neighbor who made a Hanukkah joke and he was gone for 1 year. So they wrote their personal, individual stories into their games, and that was really exciting.
The last talk in the section, which I listened to before rushing to the train station to catch my train back to Berlin, was about a 1930s family game called Jews Out.
This is a translated version that is available online. So why is this game so problematic?
The players, decent Germans of the time, are busy going through Jewish stores and identifying the Jews there, who then have to be expelled from the country.
Business, they kidnap a member of the community. Then they transport the prisoners to a collection point, and the first player to expel 6 Jews wins the game.
At the end of the game, whoever can expel the most migrants, Jews, from Germany wins. My journey to Chemnitz and back took me through cities probably familiar to many board game enthusiasts from the Colloquium player board, a strategic game set in the 19th century alternative history. My particular interest in board games is transportation games. I'm currently working on a long video about mobility and transportation board games set in Berlin and its surroundings. Subscribe to my YouTube channel to stay up to date with new videos. Happy traveling in games and real life. Tschüss!